Hey, welcome back. Today I made pecan pie, but there's weed in it. I thought this would be a good option if you're still looking for something to serve the stoners that show up to your Thanksgiving dinner. Also, I should mention the weed is in the pie crust on this, so if you don't like nuts, you can just copy the pie crust part and make a pumpkin pie or an apple pie or a chocolate pie, whatever you prefer. I also want to mention that I obviously made miniature pies just because of who I am as a person. So these are 5-inch pans and you can get them from the grocery store, or this recipe does make enough crust for one regular pie and enough filling. So if you're making a pecan pie, you can either do 3 mini pecan pies or 1 big pecan pie. Anyway, today I'm going to show you how I made 3 mini pecan pies with about 60 milligrams each. I'm starting off by weighing out my weed. I'm using just over a gram to make 3 60 milligram pies, but I'll show you how I got to that number. So, I started with the total milligrams of THC I need for the recipe. Divide that by the percent THC or CBD of the weed that I'm using, and then divide that by 1,000, and that will give you the grams of weed that you need to use for the recipe. And if you have any questions, just let me know in the comments. So once you've weighed out your weed, just grab a piece of parchment paper and we're going to break our weed up a little bit. I don't like to grind mine because the weed flavor comes through a lot more if you do grind it, so I just break it into a little bit smaller pieces. Then I'll move that onto a baking sheet and put that into my oven to decarb at 240 degrees for about 35 minutes. While that is decarbing, I'm going to start melting down my butter. So I'm adding half a cup of water and half a cup of butter to a saucepan on low heat. I'm going to melt that down until it is sitting at a stable temperature around 185 to 200 degrees, and then I'll add in my decarbed weed. I'm going to cook this for about 2.5 to 3 hours, stirring every 30 minutes or so and checking regularly to make sure I'm staying in that 185 to 200 degree range. And just a good rule of thumb is it should never bubble, so if it starts simmering, you're a little too hot. When that is finished infusing, I'll just strain out the weed. And you can already see here how the butter is kind of settling on top of the water. So I'm just going to put a lid on this and put it into the fridge for a couple of hours until that butter layer has solidified. When that butter layer is hardened, we'll pull it out of the fridge and pull the pieces of butter out of the water. I always like to weigh my butter at the end because you do lose some in the cooking process. So we started with half a cup and we need that for our recipe. So I'm going to add a little bit more regular butter until I get back to 4 ounces or a half cup. And I'll store this in the fridge until we use it because you need cold butter for your pie crust. I'm making my pie crust with a food processor, but you can also just do it in a bowl the traditional way. But either way, we'll start with 1 1/4 cups of flour. And we'll add 1 1/2 tablespoons of sugar and 1/4 teaspoon of salt and mix that together just so our dry ingredients are combined. Next, we're adding in our half cup of chilled canna butter, and you can see I broke it into smaller pieces. If you're doing this by hand, you'll just pinch the butter with the flour mixture until you have little chunks of butter throughout your flour mixture. If you're doing this in a food processor like I am, you'll just pulse it a couple of times until you have pretty small beads of butter all throughout the flour mixture. For a little bit of a size reference, here is some large pieces. That's not what we want in this instance, just because we're using canna butter. So we want to have little pieces throughout our pie crust so that the canna butter and the THC is more evenly dispersed. Then we'll take that flour mixture and move it into a bowl, or stay in the bowl you're already working with if you're doing it by hand, and we'll add up to 1/4 cup of ice water. And basically what I'm doing is I'm adding a little bit of water at a time and then fluffing it kind of with my hands or mixing it with my hands. It should stay very dry and crumbly pretty much the whole time. A good way to test it is grabbing a handful like you see here and just, if it starts sticking together when you press it with your hands, that's how you know it's ready. It should not turn into a gummy mixture. It should pretty much stay like a dry crumb the whole time. When you feel like you've got a good consistency, just move it into a ball. A lot of people transfer it onto a piece of plastic wrap or something like that, but I just leave it in the bowl because I'm lazy and it works anyway. Here I'm just showing how you lose a little bit on your hand, so that's why I use one hand the whole time, and then I switch to a spatula to grab those last little pieces of flour into my ball. And finally, I'll put a little bit of plastic wrap over this and stick it in the fridge for about an hour or so to rest. When my dough has finished resting, I'm going to roll it out. So we'll start by flouring our surface as well as our rolling pin. And then you just grab our big ball of dough. I always like to kind of flatten it with my hand first before I start rolling. And then we're just going to roll it out until it is a large flat piece that is about 1/8 of an inch thick. When that is rolled out, I'm going to cut out the shape of my mini pie tin, or roughly the shape. I did a pretty rough job on this one, but we'll put our excess dough to the side for our later mini pies. And I'm actually going to roll this out a little bit more, just to make it a little bit thinner and also larger. You don't want to try to stretch your pie dough out once you put it in the tin, so you don't want to try to like press it up the sides just because the pie will retract while it's baking. So it's better to start with an overhang of pie or like a little bit larger of a pie crust than you need. So next you can see here, I'm pulling off any extra bits and I'm just making sure it's pressed tightly to the edge of my pie tin to make sure I'm doing everything I can to prevent it from retracting in the oven. So now I am working on the crust and I am just using my fingers to tuck under the edge, and I'm just going to do that all the way around until I get kind of a smooth edge or a relatively smooth edge. You can leave it like this or you can press it with your knuckles to make that zigzag edge. That's kind of the traditional pecan pie look, so I did that for all of mine. And then we will just repeat this process with our remaining pie dough until we have filled all 3 of our miniature pie tins. Now, if you are doing this with a large pie, or a regular size pie, I should say, you'll just want to make sure you're using all of the pie dough. So this is where the wheat is, this is where the THC is. We don't want to be throwing that away. And also you want to make sure your dosing is relatively accurate. So you don't want to throw away a piece of your pie dough if you have a little bit of extra, just because then we'll have no clue how much is in the pie. So also if you're making mini ones, it's important to try to get them relatively even if you can. You don't want to have one really small pie crust and one really big one, because again, we don't really know the dosing if we do that. So we'll just repeat this process until we have all 3, and then I stick them in the fridge until we are ready to fill them. To make the filling, we'll start with 1/2 cup of sugar. I'm doing an even ratio of white and brown sugar, so 1/4 cup of each, but some people feel really strongly about using one or the other. So whatever you do, we need 1/2 cup of sugar total. We will follow that with 1/2 cup of corn syrup, and you can use light or dark, whichever you prefer, and then we'll mix that together until it is fully combined. To that, we will add 2 eggs and 2 tablespoons of melted butter, along with 1 teaspoon of vanilla, and mix that as well. And lastly, we will add 1/4 teaspoon of salt, 1½ tablespoons of flour, and 2/3 cup of chopped pecans. And you can add more chopped pecans if you want, but we will be adding them to the top of the pie as well, so keep that in mind. Next, we're just adding our filling into our pie crusts. So as you can see, the nuts have kind of floated to the top of our sugar mixture. So if I was to pour this, one of my mini pies would have a lot of nuts and one of them would have mostly just that sugar mixture. So that's why I'm scooping it, to try to get a more even ratio. But if you're making a big pie, you can obviously just pour it in. The final step is to top our pies with some pecan halves. So I'm just doing a ring around it with 1 pecan in the middle. It almost looks like a flower, actually. I'll just repeat that on my other 2 pies, and now they are ready to be baked. Since mine are mini, I am moving them onto a baking sheet just to make it easier to get them in and out of the oven. But we will bake our pies at 350 for about 35 to 45 minutes, longer if you have a big one. A good way to test if they're finished is by shaking it. So here you can see it's still kind of moving, liquidy. That means it's not done. And then once it's solidified on top, you know it is done. I let them cool for about an hour, and then that is it. They're ready to go. Like I said, they should be about 60 milligrams each, but with homemade edibles it is hard to tell, so just eat half if you need to, and keep in mind it can take 2 to 3 hours for edibles to fully kick in. Let me know what you thought of this recipe and video in the comments. I would love to hear any suggestions or requests that you might have, and if you try making these at home, I would love to see pictures. You can find me on Instagram. As always, thank y'all so much for watching, and I hope you have a really great holiday.